I've just decided in my life that I cannot ask other people to do for me what I'm not willing to do for them. That one thing that I need to do is to protect their dignity. So I will not go down the road of judging or projecting or demonizing.
Welcome back to the Mending Divides podcast, where we explore conflict in a world increasingly marked by fear and fragmentation with those who think deeply about it. I'm your host, Jared Swigert. Today's episode is a gift. I sit down with one of my personal heroes and a founding voice in the global field of conflict transformation, Dr. Paul Lederach. Paul has spent decades walking into the world's most entrenched conflicts, not with answers, but with presence, story, and deep commitments to listening. He's helped communities imagine new ways of being together beyond violence, beyond polarization, toward healing and repair. In this conversation, we explore a powerful shift in how we engage conflict. Paul invites us to embrace what he calls a circulation approach to peace building, one that doesn't wait for people to come to the table, but instead moves into the real lives and lived experiences of others. It's a way of showing up that looks a lot like Jesus. So whether you're a pastor, an educator, a parent, or simply someone who's heartbroken over the divides in your community, this episode is for you. Let's jump in. Well, Paul, I'm thrilled for the opportunity to be in this conversation with you. When I first started exploring the importance of conflict transformation, there's actually a field out there, and this was about 20 years ago. Everybody said Paul Lederach is who you need to be reading. And so to be on with you here today is a great privilege. And I know that many of us are excited about this conversation because we're eager to get your take on how we show up in this particular moment in time. And so I've read nearly everything that you've written, but I don't want to start there. And I actually don't even want to start with, I don't even want to start with your analysis of this moment. We'll get there. I wonder if you would invite us into some of the story behind the writing and even your own journey into conflict and recognizing that this is a field of study, a way of entering into and engaging the world that's worth your life. When did this begin for you? And tell us a little bit of your story of honing the craft of conflict transformation.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate it. It's great to be with you and all of the people listening a warm greeting. I would go back clearly to my family, my parents, my childhood. I grew up a pastor's kid. For good and for worse, I probably got saved a dozen times. We used to go to some of those meetings when we were little kids and crawl under the benches and whenever the hands had to go up, we were in the back. At least my dad could say, I see that hand. He saw at least one.
Yeah.
Or two, me and my brother. That aside, my parents were spectacular. They had a deep commitment to people and relationships. They worked a lot with family and marriage issues over the years. But in retirement, they ended up living in Belfast. They went to the hardest places in the world to live and actually gained
no way
to this kind of work. And so they, in many regards, there's a big piece of this that traces to a sense of having been born into and grown into a family that really nurtured care for who we were and how we were in the world. I share that because I just was digging through some files for some Social Security reasons to find, things like birth certificates and whatnot at my age that we're starting to navigate, and came across my draft notification. I had to go down in central Kansas to a place that was toward the end of the Vietnam War. I grew up in a family and a congregational orientation of the Mennonites that had a alternative service and a pacifist orientation to conflict, to the military service. And that was formative because at a pretty young age, you have to decide how you're going to navigate that. You had to make some decisions.
Yeah.
And it caught me at my late high school years and my early college years, which actually, 50 years ago now is when I first started taking the very early courses that existed around conflict and peace studies. There weren't a lot of full-blown programs, but there were classes that were kind of inciting my imagination. I took off a 3-year block that turned into more like 4 for an alternative service to the military service. And I ended up in Belgium working in support of African students, primarily coming out of places like Congo and Rwanda and Burundi, who were studying at the university level. And I was there to make meals and walk floors and play chess till midnight and argue over, what's the best way to change the world. And that was even more important than the university in some ways. But it was in those years, probably my early 20s, that I said, okay, I want to figure out a way to pursue a major to really try to dive deeper into this. And I do have an undergraduate degree in peace studies and history.
Mm.
And I literally never left it. I feel so blessed in many ways that what I felt vocationally connected to, I could find a way to professionally work on. Probably the biggest piece of the puzzle, though, that you're asking about around conflict transformation came at the point where I could understand and the deeper analysis of all the international conflicts that were going on and things that were happening. But I was discovering that it was really complicated to navigate conflict between people you were proximate to, you lived with, and that you actually believed alike. But when you had differences, we didn't know how to handle them well. So you end up with a lot of conflicts that didn't turn out too well. And I had a small shift in my work that moved me more into understanding better how conciliation, mediation, dialogue processes worked.
Mm-hmm.
And that my biggest influences in that area were actually the Quakers. And I pursued much more through my graduate degree. I basically went for a doctorate by following the Quakers. And these were people that I think influenced, along with my own tradition, the idea that this is about developing deep relationships with people, staying with it for longer periods of time.
Yeah.
And most significantly, understanding that there's no real quick fixes. So the idea of a resolution quickly is not nearly as challenging as asking the question, what is it that has to change here? What's the quality of relationship that has to change in who we are together and why these patterns tend to repeat themselves over time?
Mm-hmm.
And that led in my writing to the kind of thing that you're sort of indicating, which was I began to center more the idea of how do we pursue really constructive and more enduring change, as opposed exclusively to trying to arrive at agreements and solutions. Although those remain significant, it's that bigger and deeper question that I've always tried to pursue.
Yeah. I feel like one of the things that I've really captured from your literary mentorship of me is this concept that conflict actually is both inevitable and a great opportunity. As I've read you throughout the years, John Paul, there is just such a relational impulse that seems to drive your practice. It drives your thought leadership in your writing. Even you just alluded to staying with it. And, the notion that for many of us, I think getting to a resolution is it's a laudable outcome, but there's more to agreements here. Speak to that a little bit. What's the value that you see in conflict right now? And what are some of the things that we need to be thinking about or doing differently to stay with it? Because I just feel like we're in this moment where it feels fuseless, or if I disagree with you, or if you offend me, we're done. It's over. There isn't a stick-to-itiveness that you speak of. How do we do this?
Yeah. Well, so the things that I've found to be enduring in my own work and practice are less the particular models and techniques than they are about how we both shape and commit to continued growth in what I would call the quality of presence and the quality of relationship, wherever we're located and whatever we're doing. Quality of presence for me in a lot of ways is about sustaining a deep commitment to curiosity, to understanding better what other people have experienced and what they're going through and why it is that they've arrived to where they're at. Sometimes the translation of the biblical language is that patience is often translated as long suffering.
Yeah.
And it's true. We work in places where people have experienced the unspeakable. They've lost friends, they've lost family, they've lost everything. They've been the targets of hatred. They have grown up where protecting us against them is the only way we survive. So there's a lot of this that requires a really deep patience. And I think curiosity is underpinned most significantly by humility. Humility really it's not always easy to teach these things, by the way, as a professor, but humility really is the understanding that you don't have it all. You don't know it all. So truth is always unfolding at deeper and deeper layers of understanding. And without humility, you don't have that kind of commitment to continue to listen to and look into. So that's that quality of presence. I think quality of relationship is at the core of so much of this. It has to do with finding our way back to our mutually shared humanity. Yeah, I've tried to work with a term that sometimes is well accepted and sometimes not. But I've noticed that in so many of the places that I've worked, the deepest driver of why these conflicts are so protracted, cyclical in their return to violence, is often because there's a deep process of humiliation and a really significant level of suffering that people experience. And that humiliation comes with a dehumanization. Our dictionary has a word for dehumanization. But if you go to the dictionary, you can't find a word for rehumanization. So how do we make our way back? How do we make our way back through and into relationships that have been harmed and that we have harmed and that we have experienced harm from?
Yeah.
And what I've noticed, of course, is that we typically in the human community, we have a much longer memory of the harms we've suffered. And we have a very short memory of the ways that over generations, our people have contributed to the suffering of others. And I think this is part of that picture of why I talk about it as staying with it, is that, the real keys, I think, to change are this relational component, the ability to be honest and vulnerable with other people about who you are and what you believe, the ability to be non-defensive when differences show up and really confront you, that choosing not to move down that route of reactivity and defensiveness, but to stay engaged with that curiosity. And then the third element, to stay with the relationship, because the drive of deep and toxic polarization is that you create safety by getting away from it. And sometimes, obviously, that's physically true. It is, you need to run. There are moments where there is no alternative. But that metaphor is very much the metaphor that we find in a lot of explanations of conflict, are metaphors of separation, of moving away, of finding ways to turn our face away from conflict rather than toward it. And I think the long journey toward that rehumanization is really that ability to turn and engage the hard things and then stay with it. So those have been, I would just put them in those two things rather than a lot of techniques or frameworks. Is how do you hone and nurture the quality of your presence, and how do you hone and work that deep process, the hard work of relationships?
That's brilliant. I'm struck in this moment, and to bring this to a Jesus-looking faith, I'm struck by these two qualities of presence and relationship personified by Jesus, of course, in the way that he was here. And it strikes me that Jesus seemed to be fully present, fully engaged. Whoever was in front of him, that person was the most important moment in the world for him. It seemed like everything else fell away and Jesus was fully engaged in what was happening right here, even if that person was a constructed other irritant or enemy. And then I'm also struck by this notion that Jesus was the only one that ever took anyone beyond neighbor love to enemy love, which requires this long suffering. It requires presence. It requires humility. It requires a desire to understand rather than to conquer or to eliminate. And so how, as someone with a Mennonite upbringing and schooled in a kind of a Quaker approach to some of this, do share with us a little bit how a faith in a cross-wearing, enemy-loving God has actually shown up in the way that you have approached conflict internationally, nationally, and even interpersonally.
Yeah. Well, a lot of layers, but let me go to the simplest explanation because sometimes they're most revealing. I think in the reference that you make about Jesus, that there was a singular guidepost. And that guidepost was essentially that see a person first.
Yeah.
You didn't see a Gentile. You didn't see a revered Pharisee who knew things importantly at the synagogue or whatever. You saw a person first.
Yeah.
And within that, I think, particularly from the Quaker tradition, that the whole of the understanding of creation is that there is that of God in each of us. And so even in those that you may fear or that are threatening, it's not to lose sight of the fact that there is that of God in the other person. And how to stay connected to the fact that no matter what, this remains human beings that are in relationship and are connected. I remember a Catholic priest in Colombia teaching me one time, because I was asking how he would go out of his community to places where militias, paramilitaries,
Yeah.
or sometimes on the other side of the coin, leftist guerrilla movements that were coming through. He would go out to try to recuperate young kids or to bring somebody back from the community who had been kidnapped. And he would find himself facing um, those people carrying the guns straight on.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, the first thing I do is that when I look at that person, I remember that they are a son or a daughter of somebody,
Mm-hmm.
that they are a person. So I think the fundamental one is the capacity to see a person first. Now, obviously, those of us that come from more of that pacifist orientation, there's a lot of ways that we get pushed and shoved on how far that can be taken as a political extension. But I think that the ethos of it is really that I have found over the years. So I can't judge the choices that other people make,
Mm-hmm.
but I can commit myself to protect the dignity of every person that I meet.
Mm-hmm.
That I actually learned from a very good friend of mine in Belfast, Brendan McAllister, whose
Mm-hmm.
name you may hear. Brendan and Joe Campbell were two
Mm-hmm.
people who started the mediation services in a lot of the cross community
Yeah.
work. Now, I went any number of times, particularly with Brendan, Joe on a couple of occasions, that we would go into the Maze prison to meet the people who had been found and convicted of murder for participation in one or another of the paramilitary groups in the Irish context.
Yeah.
In the Maze prison, there are big H blocks. It formed an H so that there would be a corridor between the two long, that make up the H formation of the letter H. And in each of those long corridors, that would be controlled by one military group or another within the prison. And there would always be a commander who was ahead of that. So you would come in and you would be immediately taken to the cell of the commander. And there people would gather, they'd sit on bunks all around you and be that whole range of things. One of the times that we went in, we met only one time with only one person in complete solitary, direct one-on-one meeting, Brendan, myself, and a person who had taken the lives of quite a number of people. It was a Catholic funeral procession, and he had hidden within the procession and then killed people that were a part of that and then fled across the field and was eventually captured. I came out of that particular meeting almost physically shaking because there was it was such a level of non-remorse, of absolutely having no sense of feeling at all of anything other than he would have done it over and over again. It was like an absolute location, not even going into long justifications of the rightness of his cause, really. And it felt to me like it was almost beyond comprehension. But I was a person coming from more of a Mennonite Protestant background. My colleague Brendan was Catholic. Now here's this Catholic colleague of mine, this mediator, sitting across from this person who came from a Protestant background, but who had chosen deep violence against the Catholic community. And I kept feeling and watching Brendan make the commitment to be respectful and to seek to understand and be curious and be invitational. Things I was having difficulty myself pulling off. When we got out of that Maze prison, you come out through these turnstiles and you get out and you sort of feel like you've come out and the waft of the inside smoke and the corridors and everything else that's in there, where you come out into the open air and it's like your breath comes in again almost.
Yeah.
And I looked over at Brendan and I said, I don't know how you do it. And he said, well, I've just decided in my life that I cannot ask other people to do for me what I'm not willing to do for them. Well, that one thing that I need to do is to protect their dignity. So I will not go down the road of judging or projecting or demonizing. And that to me was a very powerful lesson of somebody who was in the middle of it and for a lifetime.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in this, John Paul, to your point, this is not a tactic or a strategy. This pours out of who this person is at his very core.
That quality of presence and very quality of who they choose to be in the world.
Right. And so I think my question there for you is like how, I don't know, in peacemaking and conflict transformation, I think sometimes we get too caught up in the tactics and the strategies, and we forget that what really needs to happen is we need to become substantively different kinds of people who show up into every scenario, whether it's interpersonally or it's something systemic, institutional, some kind of global whatever conflict we find ourselves in. How do we show up into that space already having committed to the idea that the person sitting in front of me is a beloved image bearer of God.
Yeah.
You know, like as you talked with him, and even as you've done this work, bring us into the interior formation that generates that kind of ethic or that kind of habit that you admired in your friend.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the ways to describe this is that all of us carry kind of the brilliance of a light and the challenge of our shadow side. Or I think that there is deep work to be done around where that sits and how it expresses itself. So part of it for me is that I've learned where my little triggers are.
Yeah.
Well, I've learned to take note of them so that I can catch myself when it's emergent. It's the hardest when you're closest to home. So your family often is a good laboratory because you start letting everything down so you realize that you're not the saint that you think you are when you're with other people.
Yeah.
But when I am in places where, whether it's as a professor with students or whether it's in a conference and somebody's confronted, or whether I'm sitting across a table and somebody says something that is totally confrontational with what I believe, my trigger tends to be that when I find myself becoming defensive, it indicates to me that I'm insecure. And it's not going directly at the defensiveness that I tried for at the deeper level, but it's asking about what it is that doesn't feel secure. Because I think the more secure that you can find to hold fast to those things that you believe are true and to be open to those things that you don't fully know, the less you have a need to be defensive and the more you can open up toward, one, sharing honestly what you do see, but two, not being reactive in the way you deal with other people that sort of pulls you into a cycle of, ultimately taking some form of judging or demonizing.
Right.
And those are slippery slopes. It's not hard in this day and age because so much of what we get comes by way of like social media and other things. And we can just sit back and say, well, that idiot, or that's, whatever it is that we don't like, which, I tend to do. Sometimes you just have to get it out, I suppose. But it is really far more slippery than I think. So for example, I've always tried to engage my students in particular while I was in teaching mode, where I would hear somebody say something akin to, hate the sin, but love the sinner. And I would say, okay, hold on a minute here. But when hate creeps, no matter in what form,
that's right.
Where's it taking you?
Yeah.
And how far away are you from the actual slope that this person seems to be sliding on, according to your view?
Yeah. Right.
And what is it that we're going to nurture, and what is it that we're going to notice in ourselves? Another Quaker, Parker Palmer, who you may have read some of his writing, tremendous educator and a great, fantastic person. He talks about it as the hidden wholeness.
Yeah.
The idea that there is a wholeness that is both about our brilliance and about the side of us that we have to look at more carefully.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always come up for us to see as easily as others may notice it. So use people around you as a mirror and a reflection. Have the capacity for a life of reflection. And I think that's the place where community comes in. That's why we talk about everything from leadership to other things we do as a journey and not a destination.
Yeah.
That this is not a one-time thing. And it's a commitment, I believe, to a deeper place.
I so appreciate the invitation into self-reflection, self-interrogation there, John Paul, because, I have a similar trigger to you, and I too would identify it as an insecurity. And my impulse, if not checked, is to use a sense of intellectual superiority to reestablish my security, or I'm going to offend, or I'm going to critique, or I'm going to judge, to manufacture a sense of security rather than pause in the moment and consider the fact that this is exposing an insecurity in me and I need to explore it. I need to take the time to actually do some of the interior work to ask the question, why? And if, to your prolific writing over time, if conflict is inevitable, and the opportunity is to navigate it well, if this is a lifelong journey, then it's going to require a lifelong habit of self-interrogation, to keep de-escalating.
Well, so here's the good news. There are endless opportunities to keep practicing.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the good news. But I want to come back to your word pause, because it's a really interesting one. And I think there are two pauses that are really useful for people to take account of and to take better notice of. I think the first step is to notice, to take notice that something is there. And the second step is to sit with it, explore it, befriend it rather than make it your enemy.
Befriend it.
And I actually would argue that you're not trying to just get rid of it. You're trying to find a way to know that this is part of you. So you're going to have it with you for a while. It's not like it's disappearing. So what are the two pauses? The first is what I would call the pause of curiosity. I think this is a very powerful thing. It's one of the things we most need right now in our deeply divided country. We just don't have enough pauses of curiosity. It's just stop enough to say, wow, okay, let me see if I understand better what the source of that is.
Yeah.
Where did that sense of suffering come from? Where does that grievance find its roots? What has been pained along the way that needs to be held? Or on the other side of that pause of curiosity that says, I've never actually stood and looked at it from that side. Let me just for a while, just walk over and stand and look at the world from that view so that I can understand it a bit better, because there may be chunks in there that I not only don't understand, but may illuminate something that I'm not fully. But it's that pause of curiosity I think is so missing. The second one is I've experienced a lot what I would call the vocational pause. I don't know about you, Jared, but it's interesting to see if this resonates or not. But when you're engaged in the kind of work that I've been involved in, and you go to a place, say, I just mentioned Belfast, but you could say Mogadishu, or you could say Managua, or you could say, Colombia out in the middle of nowhere. And you've been doing it for years. And you have deep relationships, and it's a hard and tough situation. The Colombian War lasted a half century. Belfast, they talk about 33 years of the Troubles. For most of my life, I was in places where the open armed conflict lasted longer than I had lived on the earth.
Yeah.
Right. So you're in places where you bring a kind of a deep respect to what that means. Now, you come home and you go to coffee with a friend or on a Saturday morning, or maybe somebody grabs you, going out of church or something, depending on where you're navigating. And they say, oh, you're back from Bogota, or you're back from Belfast. How did it go?
How was your trip?
How was your trip? Did you get anything? Did you get anything accomplished? Anything good? And in that second, inside of you, the world stops for a minute because you're having a vocational pause.
Yeah.
And the vocational pause is, do I take the short route and give a quick answer to get out of this conversation? Or do I take the long answer about what's been happening and how hard it is?
Yeah.
But behind that, there's the third one, which is, why am I involved in this?
Yeah.
How long will it last?
Hmm.
How long can this go? Who am I really? What am I bringing of difference and significance to this world?
Yeah.
And that vocational pause, I think, stops us short in the conversation for a moment because we're searching for which of the pathways to kind of take at that particular moment. But at a deeper level, I think a vocational pause is that we really are exploring the sense of what it is that we uniquely have been asked to, the voice that speaks deeply within us, to be present to and to work with in this world that we know is not only difficult, but that probably will not be complete in a lifetime.
Yeah.
And there are times where you have some pretty deep questions about that. I got that a lot working with international students in my classes. People that would come to class basically come to a master's degree program straight from Congo or straight from Rwanda or straight from, Israel or Palestine or locations like that. And they'd be sitting in my class and we'd come to office hours and they would come in asking me a technical question about some book and frame of reference that we were looking at. And I could tell that's not really the question that they had. The question that they had that they wanted to get to was, who am I? What am I doing here when my people are suffering?
Yeah.
What difference is this going to make? So I actually shifted my office hours. The last 5 or 6 years that I taught at University of Notre Dame in particular, in the little syllabus, we had office hours. I said, here's office hours, but send me an email because if you want to talk, I want to walk. And we have 2 lakes on the Notre Dame campus.
Yeah.
And I would say we'll walk one of the lakes. And so rather than sitting in an office, we would walk side by side and something different would happen about where people wanted to take their questions when you walk side by side around the lake. To the degree that even now, all these years later, I'll sometimes get an email from a former student that will write and say, I need a 2-lake walk.
I need a 2-leg walk.
And what they're saying is, I got something that's working me that's so deep, but it's about who I am. And it's about this voice that I'm trying to get back aligned with.
Yeah. That strikes a really personal chord, John Paul. I was in a bomb shelter a few days after October 7th in Jerusalem with Israeli and Palestinian colleagues. And one of my colleagues reached to me and said, I need you to remind me again why we're doing this together. Because we've been working together for over 15 years, and it's worse now than it was when we began.
Yeah.
And that it created a existential crisis for me a little bit, because he's absolutely right. But it also awakened in me, I guess, this idea that I've been socialized into, that when I put my mind to something and get my energy behind it, we can fix this thing.
Yeah.
And the reality of some of the conflicts that I know that you've been a part of and that I've been a part of, despite our best energy, we're not going to fix them. We're not going to see it in our lifetime. And so how do we, and most of us aren't dealing with international catastrophes. Most of us, the pain of conflict that we feel is deeply proximate, is deeply personal. It's that relationship with my mom or my dad or my brother, or that person I used to call my dearest friend, or a colleague or a pastor or whatever it is. It's far closer to home, but it's the pain feels similar. How do we keep at it when things feel worse now than they did yesterday, or they feel worse now than they did 3 months ago? What do we do as reconcilers when it doesn't feel like there's a light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah. Well, it's a question that I've certainly had struggled with for a long time. I'm currently about to release a book. The whole of the book, in many ways, it has to do with a phrase that I'm really working with, that came initially through conversations with a very dear friend who's a poet. And it has to do with the word vulnerable. And that vulnerability, the word vulnerable in Latin traces to vulnis, which is actually the word wound. So we have a lot of us who are in some form of the helping professions, the accompanying professions.
Yeah.
Those that come alongside people that are hurting or need help. It could be medical, it could be social work, it could be mediation, it could be peace building, accompaniment is kind of a word. I know that you use the word companion. The company and the companion share the same Latin root, which is kompan, which is with bread. It's bread baking. It's about being around a table together, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have this sense that we're there to accompany, but we also have this deeper sense that part of that will come to fruition.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It will lead to healing as a cure.
Right.
And what this poet friend helped me understand, his name is Mark Nepo. He's written a lot of books. He's kind of a wisdom carrier in a lot of ways. Was that who we are in life is that we all are vulnerable. We all are wounded.
Yeah.
And the question is not whether we have wounds, but how we will carry our wounds gracefully with myself and in the presence of wounds with others. And I think that ultimately that question that your friend asked you in that bunker, which was that vocational pause question pretty deeply in an existential moment, right? But it was also a moment where the felt presence of you, your arm, and maybe the other 2 or 3 that were there, that there was probably something that was felt about your fragility in that moment, the impossibility that you have control over the things that you would like to see changed.
Right.
But the commitment to be present with each other, with the wounds we carry, in forms that are spacious and graceful, is actually about a journey of healing, not a journey of fixing. a journey of being alongside and having alongsideness as an understanding of the actual quality of what we're pursuing, as opposed to finding a perfect solution. Because guess what? I study perfect solutions. I've been the head of a study program for years that oversaw the comparative peace agreements written over the last 30 years around the world, and trying to understand better what works and doesn't work. And what we found pretty consistently is that peace agreements are a moment in time.
That's
What
right.
matters is how you got there, and what matters most is what happens in the relationships that implements them.
Yeah.
The quality of some solution is only as good as the quality of the relationships that come around the things that need to be done. Which, so even if you have a quotes the fix, you don't. This is the great paradox.
Yeah, that's right.
And you continue the journey in spite of the fact that you don't control it. And this I think has been probably the hardest lesson to learn, because a lot of us would like to find better ways to control the outcomes that we're trying to produce.
That's right.
I think that's probably not a good recipe for staying healthy. So wholeness is about knowing that it's possible to continue to carry wounds gracefully.
Mm. So that's actually personally very helpful, because I'm struck by how since that bunker, things have gotten a lot worse, but the intimacy that I share with that particular friend was deepened in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in it together differently, despite the fact that it's getting worse, you know, which doesn't excuse the fact that violence continues to rain down upon people. But this notion of healing rather than fixing, there's a lot of unlearning that I think we have to do as we're thinking about conflict, and in particular this moment in time. And so I want to chat for a moment about this moment in time. I mean, you have spent so much of your life's work in the trenches of international conflicts and analyzing them and teaching people to do the same and companioning people as they grow their capacity for peacemaking across all sorts of different kinds of fields. And now we live in a moment in time where here in our own country, things feel more divided, tenuous, fragile, maybe even dangerous than they have in my lifetime. And help us see this moment from your point of view, John Paul. What are you seeing right now that has you most concerned? And what are you seeing right now? What's the opportunity of this moment? What's kind of growing your creativity, optimism, maybe even hope in this unique moment?
Yeah, well, I'm assuming
You're referencing here at home in the United States.
Yeah, here in the U.S. Yeah, exactly.
a lot of places we could think about this globally, obviously, as well, but here where we actually live. No, I think it is probably the most fragile. The fabric of our very relationships has been impacted. So many of us appeal to the core documents that founded this country, the Constitution. But I don't think we appeal enough to the basic social contract that Constitution assumes.
Yeah.
And the kind of respect and the nature of working together through deep difference that can be geographic by location in different parts of the country, can be by backgrounds that we have, that social contract was really about fundamental commitment to doing politics without violence. And we are constantly moving to the edge and off and back again of crossing that border of where violence could become far more the norm. It certainly has become in the way we treat each other.
Mm-hmm.
Or in case of not treating each other, we no longer even have relationships or contacts, that we felt our fabric of our very community, sometimes our home communities, sometimes our families, and sometimes those places that we even worship being torn apart by the differences that we have. And there is a much more of a normalization of both not just seeing the other as threatening, but demonizing those that are different than we are. And an unwillingness to look, I think, at the deeper journeys of how people have arrived to where they're at and what they've experienced as harm and how they're expressing that. And I think, Bethel Heine, the philosopher, once said that violence is the option of a person who can imagine no other alternative.
Yeah.
And I think many people are sitting at the margins of that statement, that they fear that it's moving in those directions and they're watching it happen. We live just very close here. We walked on Pearl Street in Boulder many times. And just yesterday, we saw yet another kind of unleashing of that kind of projected violence. And it's a very difficult moment. There's a part of me that also would say that I think there has been a falling back almost exclusively to blame as a way of escaping responsibility, of projecting a kind of a survival view that if they win, we lose. In most of the places that I've been, the core justification that begins to bring violence forward and then cyclically repeats itself over time is that if we don't kill them, we will be killed.
Yeah.
If they are not eliminated, we will be eliminated. That everything is framed in a survival mode. I think to answer your particular question, one of the things that gives me greatest pause is how often people seem to frame everything in terms of an us and them survival. Obviously, there are very different viewpoints of how this democracy should work. And I fear that we're on a very slippery slope that has started in very significant ways, where a diminishment in our basic institutions, the trust in those institutions has begun to fully diminish, if not collapse. And there is an active way to continue to make that happen. But there are very concrete ways in which I would describe it as a funnel vision as compared to a circle vision. A little bit of writing just for myself recently on this, trying to get a sense of it. A funnel vision was a phrase I once heard a senior diplomat use about how mediation should happen in these tough situations. And the chaos that's out there, you can kind of see my hands, Jeremy, but the chaos that's out there is somehow brought through this funnel, and that funnel is you. So you want all that chaos brought through so that you can ultimately have control over the outcome. And I think there's a lot of effort right now to diminish the capacity of wide deliberative dialogue to be moved in the direction of there only being one right way to do things. And that creates a kind of a funnel that has to come through a certain way of doing it. And I fear that that's going to be quite challenging, that we're going to have a lot of work ahead of us. What do I see as, I think, the real sense of hope is that so much of what we've done internationally does have these far more visible high-level processes that people tend to look at when they ask, hey, how did the war end? How did this polarized conflict move to something that was back in the direction of, the circle of deliberative democracy in the context of deep difference and historic differences? And I think what I've found that higher level, while highly significant, was not nearly as powerful as the everyday level. That what matters most is how we mobilize around the places where we actually live, and how we began to move and circulate around different sets of people in ways that are unusual, and where we mobilize that imagination that it's possible to live together without violence.
Yeah.
I just participated for 5 years as an advisor to the Truth Commission that was established in Colombia as a part of their National Peace Accord.
Yeah.
And, hard work, because they're looking back across 50 years, a half century of really deep, abusive and difficult situations that involved a great deal of loss of life and displacement of people. And the name of their commission, it translated from Spanish, was almost poetic. I mean, it was very unusual as their Truth Commission, to make it short, but it was to shed light on the truth. This is the full, I'm going to say it in English now, it's the full name. The Commission to shed light on the truth, and to learn to live together and never repeat violence. That was the title of the commission.
Wow.
So how does a commission go about its work to shed light on what's happened, contribute to the ways people can live together and never repeat violence? Now, the word in Spanish, convivir, to live together is often translated in English as coexistence, but it's not.
Yeah.
Coexistence is kind of, I'll let you do your thing, I'll do my thing.
Yeah.
To live together is a form of neighborliness that says we will find a way to come back. And so I think the tension I'm experiencing is the views of a funnel vision where there is only one right way and only one set of people who will decide. And the circle, which is that what we need lies within and between us. And that we have to find ways to do that, knowing that no one of us has full control.
Yeah.
And no one of us will fully get everything, but that all of us will have a contribution to make to the collective well-being we choose to be as a people. And I think that's the tension. And that's also the hope, because I see people doing it. And I think it's more possible locally where we have the courage to take it up, because we can follow the simple principle of accessibility. Start where you have access.
Right. Start where you have access. You started with, in these international peace processes, people tend to see the peace accords or these final moments of some kind of diplomacy or legislation. What people don't see are the ambassadors for a better way, a hopeful alternative, slowly making their way around dinner tables and cafe tables and front porches and doing the hard, slow work of building relationships with people with whom we disagree. And I've heard you speak even just recently about this circulatory approach. And I'd love for you to bring us into this, because I think this is for all of us. This isn't for the professional humanitarians and peace builders and diplomats. There is a circulatory, deeply relational way of bridging into relationship with people despite disagreement that I think is so deeply necessary. I think it may be one of the most radical embodiments of the gospel, if you will, of our time. I think it's the hopeful alternative to this tribalism that is setting up all of these invisible boundaries and barriers and walls between us that we think that we can't transcend or, dismantle together. Talk to us about this circulatory approach and speak of it in a way that is as relational as it actually is, for all of us, not just for people who are thinking about this vocationally, but for people who are navigating the divides that we're talking about here on a daily basis.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, because it actually is in process right now, a new piece of writing and emergent from actual practice in a lot of different locations and ways of thinking about it. So it's kind of comparing circulation with convening. So convening would be the model that we are more familiar with in the field I work. So we facilitate, we find stakeholders, the language kind of all follows us. We find the stakeholders to a conflict. We find representatives of those that we bring into conversation and dialogue. We try to reach understanding and eventually agreement that is then carried back to the various populations that are affected. So convening is, as metaphor, you're bringing people to a table.
Yes.
And circulating is you go out to the tables where people live.
Come on.
When I first started really getting a sense of this, because it's a huge part of the actual work that I've done, but I never had framed it in quite this way until I started reading out of roughly the 1940s and 50s, so almost 80 years ago, entomologists, people who study insects, termites and bees and spiders and stuff, right? They framed this question, and the question was this: how do whole collectives cohere around common purpose without centralized control? How do whole collectives cohere around purpose without centralized control? And they answered their question pretty simply by traveling around in very unique ways. So ants travel. As you ever sat and watched an ant or a termite colony do its thing, there'll be a couple ants that head out, and all of a sudden others will follow because they made a right turn here rather than a left turn. You'll notice a whole file of them peeling off in a certain direction. But essentially what they said was they travel and they leave a scent in the landscape.
Huh.
And by leaving a scent in the landscape, what they were actually referring to was that they were gathering things that were useful and needed, hints of those, and they were leaving what they had understood were others as they came around, and they just kept moving around the landscape. Bees who circulate pollinate. And pollinate does this very unique thing, which is you're gathering something that's useful for the collective of the hive, the honey that will be made, right? But as you're doing it and you're moving in places, you're dropping things that become useful to a much wider ecosystem of good. And so essentially that kind of sprung in my mind the notion of circulation and convening. So I began to notice very clearly that there are extraordinary ways in which when the work that you're doing to cultivate the ability of people to actually reimagine relationship where they are so separated they can't even meet or talk, which has been the mainstay of my work, in smaller teams and with sometimes highly unique individuals, there still are people who are stitching threads of conversations around that divided landscape.
Yeah.
And as they actually travel and do that, they're gathering and leaving, gathering and leaving, gathering. So I'm going to use a couple of I words. They're itinerating, they're traveling out rather than bringing people to. They're iterating, they're coming back and over again. And they're evoking an imagination about a conversation without necessarily sitting at the same table.
Yeah.
Now, what's curious about it is there's several elements to this. Actually, there are some places in the world, Paul would want it was where I had more than a decade and a half of deep experience of people actually mobilizing around massive land, forest, and natural resource conflicts. This whole approach. So I'm going to go now to the spider for just a moment, because I so you can follow my full etymology.
Love it.
A spider, especially an orb web weaver, that spider that makes those extraordinary webs, that if you wake in the morning and there's, been a wet night and you see a bit of dew, you can actually see the whole thing that was invisible. And what you catch, of course, is that middle section of all the hubs and the center and the periphery. What you may not initially notice is that there are a number of threads of silk that go the furthest out to the places that were strategic anchor points for the spider. Those are the first ones that are laid. They're the longest, and they're the longest lasting. They create a small star around which everything else is accomplished. Then the movements of the spider are first around the periphery, then to the center, all of it in circles, and then radii that move out and connect. They create hubs in every place that they travel, and the hubs are the crisscrossing places. The reasons for that is that they are combining interdependence and independence. The sense that any part of the web may eventually be hit by the wind or a large animal and be destroyed, but other parts of the web will continue that they can then repair. And they spend a large portion of their time, maybe 60 or more percent, repairing what they're weaving, not just creating new. All of these are small metaphors that I want to come back to. What we found was that if you can create a very small group of people who, as individuals, are actually proximate to one or more of the communities that are in the landscape of conflict. So in Nepal, that often was caste. It was often ethnic. Also, a spider group is actually Makura in Nepal. Nepal was actually the word that they use for describing this group. Would be 3 to 5 people. Each individual is closer to one of the communities in conflict than the others.
Yeah.
And group travels. And they go to the place where this person is from, and that person will arrange the space for the meeting. They will sit, they will spend time. Then they'll go to the next one and the next one and the next one. And then they come back around it again, all transparent till I think we're going to come back with what we've heard, and you're all going to hear it. So it's like developing a mediation process with no outside mediators. It's this inside team of people that are moving around that landscape, right? Now, there are some elements to this that I find absolutely fascinating. One, when you go to the place where people live and you sit and you listen deeply with time to lived experience of that place, you do this global immersion. You go to places to sit and listen to what those experiences have been. There is something that happens that is similar to but different than individual empathy. It's about a collective empathy.
Yes.
You begin to feel and see the world from the lived experience of a community, of a group of people, right? And when you do that across that landscape, you are gathering and leaving. Very similar, almost like pollination. So there is a gathering of what people feel and need or are asking for and are worried about, right? But there is a coming back, that there is also a leaving, the things that others have said, how they understand it, what might be possible. What we find is that empirically, that is by observation and noticing carefully, iteration does create a deepening of understanding. So here, a second major insight. We say far too often going in circles is going nowhere. Actually, going in circles, we do because we need to deepen something. So metaphors always have directionality to them. The conflict is heating up. We also say the conflict is really cooled down our relationships. Just here we use opposite measures of temperature to describe relationships, right? But typically our mindset is we are doing what we do in order to do A, to produce B, and eventually C. Very linear.
Yes.
Well, that we sense as contributing to something, doing something, making something happen, fixing it. It's that we do A to get B. We don't say that about circles. When we go in a circle, we say we're just not getting anywhere. We're going nowhere.
Yeah.
But in reality, so many things we do in life are actually about circles. So I'll give you an example because we're both coming from religious communities. Why would we sing the same song over and over again? Why would we say this prayer? Why would we repeat the Lord's Prayer? If we've done it once, hasn't that been enough? If we've covered this once, isn't it? Why do we keep doing? Why do we do communion? Yeah, a Catholic community. Why is the Eucharist done over? If you've done the Eucharist one time, is it not effective? Maybe you should change what you're doing.
Yes. Right.
Oh, okay. So you're not doing that for the purpose of producing something. On the other, you're doing it for the reconnection to the depth of purpose, of connection, of relationship, of context, of who we are. We're coming back and around and over again to get to that place that deepens our understanding and deepens our sense of what it is that this is about. Now, with time, that iteration does begin to create a commonality of what might be possible as next steps. So the two questions that these spider groups tended to ask was, what's been your experience? What do you need? That's kind of a first one.
Yeah.
And the second one is, what's your imagination of next steps? And the more you come around, the more that the needs have greater clarity and the more that they may be felt in common with places they had no idea felt those needs too. And the second is, there is a kind of a rising, emergent quality of participatory clarity that across the collective whole, we may have some things that we can do together. So circulation, for me, I think our circulatory system is broken right now. We literally do not move around the spaces like we used. We don't have the Saturday morning coffee shops where we used to sit. We've lost this ability to move around the very spaces where we live.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the things that holds a great deal of promise, is mobilizing people to think more creatively about how to move and to do it in small groups. I'll go back to something I said earlier. So if a group of 3 people shows up and the people in the community know that, wow, that person is from that group, that person is from that other group.
Yeah.
And here they are together and they're coming here to sit and talk to us. I can no longer listen with my eyes. What do I mean when I say listen with my eyes? I can no longer look at you and say, I know who you're with, and therefore I can determine whether I'm going to agree or disagree with you, even before you've spoken a word, because I already know where it's coming from, right? Now, if 3 people show up and they are different, it creates a surprise that means I have to stop and look again.
Yeah.
I have to do what? I have to pause for a bit of curiosity. I have to listen one step deeper than I would normally do because I'm not certain who these people are and what they're up to. And then it creates an opportunity for something that's been missing. which is a slightly more meaningful conversation. It may not be the whole thing, but it's got to be more meaningful. And so circulation, I think, has all these little tiny elements that should be done continuously, not just as an event of making a decision, but continuously for the well-being of the body. So when you started with, maybe this has overtones of the word becoming flesh,
Yes.
pitching the tent and living among us, I think you could probably describe the whole of Jesus's 30 years of ministry as circulating constantly, and across barriers, across divisions, and in ways that brought unusual people with him and along the way. And I think the Gospel of Mark, the single most used phrase is along the way. Along the way. And I think that's part of what we really need to be aiming for.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think as we look at Jesus as well, as the embodiment of the circulatory approach, I think it also confronts what I think would be the two most obvious objections to what you're offering. One being, this is wildly ineffective. It's inefficient. It takes way too much time. Wouldn't we rather do A plus B to try to get to C than to do this circulatory approach of relational deepening? That just feels like it may take too much time. Well, I think if we look at incarnation and we look at the circulatory approach of Jesus, yeah, you're right. It takes a long time and it's probably not efficient. And it's the only thing that has ever changed anything, really. And I think the second objection may be, yeah, but I don't think we can talk to people who think differently. I don't think we can do this anymore. There's too many barriers and obstacles. And I think if we look at Jesus, the kinds of polarization and dehumanizing categories that exist today existed then as well. And I think we see Jesus actually circulating into not just encounters, but maybe even deepened relationships with people who did not see the world like he saw it. And so here would be my final question for now, John Paul, and I wish this is probably worth 3 more episodes, but for those of us.
I'll come back when you want, Jerry. Don't worry.
Yeah, good. You're just going to be a resident repeating guest because we're going to need to keep talking. I think so many of us have just given up and we've said the world is polarized and it's just easier for me to be with people who think like me. And hopefully we can build enough power to get the world that we want by beating them or whatever. This concept, and I would say again, this very Jesus-looking concept of the circulatory approach, the deeply relational, time-consuming approach to rebuilding the fabric of friendship in our society is critical. But too many of us have given up on that as even being a possibility anymore. What would you say to us, to so many of us who have maybe calcified in our imaginations around even being able to pursue this kind of conversation with that ideological other or that theological other? We're not talking Nepal, we're talking the US, where, in my own city here, people they've atrophied in their ability to be friends with one another. What would you say to people with calcified imaginations right now?
Well, breathing's taken me a lifetime. And I can't do any 2 minutes without it. Good, enduring change for the collective, wider dignity of all of us requires better relationships.
Yeah.
Requires relationships of respect. Respect is a word that basically means you look, but you stop and look again. This ability to over and again create the quality of relationships that permits us to live better in great diversity around the biggest challenges we have for the survival of our globe and the human community.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just simply make the case that relationships are not done for the instrumental purpose of producing an agreement.
Yes.
Which would be a more effective way of getting agreements.
Right.
But we're not after exclusively agreements. We're after understanding how we will convivir, how we're going to live together in ways that reduce violence and increase well-being, dignity, and justice in our relationships. And those are the things that I think sit at the core of this, that it's about the places that we need to be with each other in order for us to face together things that no one of us, not even one group, can possibly assume to understand or be able to respond to without the wholeness of the rest of the community, the rest of the human species. And I think this is really the century where we're going to have to sort through the idea of a global family. And the quality of our relationships and the quality of how we engage with respect with the gift we have been given is really at the core of whether we will be able to continue as a viable species. I think our planet Earth will probably still rotate around the sun. The question is, will we be able to have something that's remotely livable with the gifts we've been given? Now, this for me, yes, it takes time, just like breathing. Yes, it takes time, just like blood is circulating throughout my body in order to make every limb of the body both available and limber for the work that it has to do. So it's one of my mentors, Adam Curl, that I mentioned earlier, was very specific about his notion of a lot of his work. He said, it's about befriending. And befriending was not done for the purpose of getting something that you want to achieve from that person. It is about actually caring for the well-being of that person, their family, their community. So this kind of sits at the core of, if you reduce the entire scripture to, one verse in the Old Testament, they said it was what? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. Those are highly impossible to imagine that outside of relationship. In the core of the New Testament teaching, it is, at essence, love your neighbor as yourself. By the way, the neighbor includes your enemy. And this becomes the core thing around which the ability of a body to stay healthy requires a circulatory system.
That's right.
That's functioning. And I think we do ourselves a disservice for our own well-being and purpose to cut off our ability to move around and be with different parts of our human community, starting with where we live.
Mm. Well, my friend, this is, truly to put a semicolon on a conversation, because there's so much more to be had. Your insight and your mentorship throughout the years, and particularly in this moment, for all of us, we're so grateful. And strength and creativity and courage to you in this season, especially as you write and you bring these things to bear, this circulatory approach, that we would capture it and that we would live it with a whole bunch of compassion and a whole bunch of courage. So thank you, my friend.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. It's been great. I hope to talk to you in the future.
For sure. As we close, I want to leave you with this. You don't have to have it all figured out to begin. Start with relationship, one neighborhood, one story that challenges your assumptions. Because peacemaking isn't a moment, it's a way of life. If this conversation stirred something in you, we'd love for you to share it with a friend, rate and review the podcast, and stay connected with us at globalimmerse.org. We've got more episodes, resources, and stories coming your way designed to help you understand what divides us and move toward it with the tools to mend them.
Make us instruments of peace. Where there's hatred, let love reign. Make us instruments of peace in dissonance.